Well, welcome to this edition of Passion Life's ongoing web discussions of abortion in the world that we live in today. Today we're going to be discussing something that's relative to current events, current times. We're calling it the scourge of racism in the inhumanity of abortion, or why the end of racism requires the abolition of abortion. The anonymous black orator and writer Othello once wrote, "Slavery, in whatever point of light it is considered, is repugnant to the feelings of nature and inconsistent with the original rights of man. It ought, therefore, to be stigmatized for being unnatural and detested for being unjust." Well, nothing truer could have ever been said, and we continue to suffer horribly from the after effects of slavery to this day in America and around the world, especially right now in light of the current events that our nation is gripped by, the pain that is being felt and expressed both by the people of color in this nation and people who are not of the minority groups. There's real anger. It's palpable and it's sensible. And yet what Othello wrote of slavery can also be said of abortion. From whatever point of light you examine abortion, abortion is repugnant to reason and it's unjust. John?
Yeah, it's good to see you again. These are very troubling times. People keep asking how we should respond to what appears to be terrible, unjust death of black men, and then responding to the rioting and just the destruction, and it just leaves us all very sad. And I tell you, my first response has been just to lament and to grieve what we're all going through as a nation right now. But it's true that when you look at slavery and you look at abortion, they share this very same deep, profound repugnance. Whether you look at it from the angle of the Bible, they're both repugnant. From human embryology, from the view of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the inalienable rights of mankind, from the viewpoint of ethics and philosophical ethics, from the perspective of the family's health and well-being as the foundation stone for a healthy culture and society. From every angle, abortion and slavery shared that same horror. In fact, I've come to the conclusion, Mark, that in many cases throughout history, abortion is the actual outworking of racism.
Yeah, you say that the two are linked together, abortion and racism. And I believe that that's true. And as you talk about that, as you think that through, can you give us some sense of how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, I've really been involved in the pro-life movement now for 30 years. I've come to a couple conclusions. Number one, it seems like the pro-life movement is not going to grow and expand and impact and change more of the culture until the pro-life movement is joined by and led by more and more African American and Latino Americans, by our minorities. On the other hand, it also seems to me that our progress in racial reconciliation and the progress of the traditional civil rights movement that was so strong in the 60s is also stuck because they have refused to follow the trajectory of their own principle, which is the dignity of human life in general, not just the black human experience. The original 60s civil rights movement was called the Civil Rights Movement, and it was about human dignity, not it was not called the Black Rights Movement. For that very reason, it was very intentional, that the need for defending black rights was based on the fact that they were humans and belonged to the human race. That's the way the argument unfolded as Martin Luther King spelled it out. So anyway, I see the two now as needing each other, and they're both going to grow together, or they're both going to stall out together. That's my view. There's several reasons why I think that abortion is actually an outworking of racism in many cases. The first one is a biblical reason. If you turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 1, you find the story that is both the foundation for the civil rights movement and a great insight as to the battle against child killing in our own day. In Exodus chapter 1, we have the story of how the Jews were made slaves in Egypt under the boot of Pharaoh for generation after generation for 400 years. The most oppressive kind of slavery. The Jews were experiencing all of that for 400 years. And in Exodus chapter 1, we begin to read of God's deliverance of the people. Let me just read to you a couple verses here. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh, said to the Hebrew midwives then, one of them was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, you shall let him live. Why did Pharaoh demand this or suggest this to the midwives? Well, the answer came in earlier, that they were concerned that the people were growing too mighty, too strong. Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. And so in order to enforce this racial enslavement and oppression, they needed to start a population control program that required child killing. That's the links right there. And of course, this story and the deliverance became the inspiration for the modern civil rights movement. And even before that, Harriet Tubman, who helped with the Underground Railroad and delivered many people out of bondage in the South into the North. She was called the Moses of that time, and she was bringing people to the promised land. All this language comes from Exodus chapter 1 and the chapters after that. Martin Luther King also, in his amazing speech at the Lincoln Memorial, he concludes his call for freedom among African Americans by appealing again to the same language and ideas that come out of Exodus chapter 1. He said, let us join hands, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Where does that come from? That comes from the experience of God delivering the Jews out of the bondage of slavery in the book of Exodus. So it's an amazing thing that we see here, that in trying to stop, in order to keep people enslaved and in bondage, Pharaoh started a child killing program. And at first he uses suggestions to the midwives. When you see this, do this. When you see little baby boys that are born, just go ahead and kill them on the spot. Well, it says that the midwives feared God, and they didn't do as Pharaoh suggested. And so he had to amp it up. And we read in the last verse of chapter 1 of Exodus, Then Pharaoh commanded, no longer a choice, he commanded all the people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So here's an example where child killing is a direct outgrowth of a kind of a racist enslavement and the need to enslave a people and to control them. Very, very powerful story. So that's one reason why I see there's a link between these two. The other big observation that I make about the link between the evil of racism and the travesty of abortion is that in America particularly, the effort to promote contraception and sterilization and eventually legalize abortion all came out of kind of the racism of the 20s and 30s called the eugenics movement, of which Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood were leaders in that effort. So as they began to promote the need to increase the right races and decrease the wrong races, that gave the reason for the development of what we now call Planned Parenthood today. All of its roots come from Margaret Sanger's commitment to an explicitly racist worldview that was popular among the elites in the 20s and the 30s. Among the many things that she did and wrote, in 1939 she launched what they called the Negro Project. And it was to promote birth control among African American neighborhoods. Now, birth control was a euphemism for the time, meaning abortion. They didn't use the word abortion much in those days. They used birth control. Birth control later on becomes our word for talking about contraception, but then it meant more about abortion. So on December 10th, 1939, she wrote a letter to the project manager of this effort about the need to reach out to black ministers to help promote this project of birth control among our black neighborhoods. She wrote, "We do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." So this is part of the horrific story that we're now still struggling with today. And it shows the interlocking nature of racism and abortion today that is just so overwhelmingly sad. But a lot of this history now is being promoted and made public by Kanye West is the latest one to start promoting how Planned Parenthood is a racist organization in its roots, no matter how they're trying to purge all that history now.
Yeah, exactly. In the last couple of days, I've been keeping up with some of the news about Kanye West and the things that he's been saying. He specifically said that Planned Parenthood was started by a white supremacist group of white supremacists, and that its backings were explicitly racist and eugenics was a part of it. And Planned Parenthood just today has just absolutely pushed back with all their might on the idea that Margaret Sanger was a racist and that Planned Parenthood was started, had a history or roots in the eugenics movement. If you are listening to this webcast today and you're unfamiliar with that history, and you go online, no matter what you think of Kanye West, you go online and you start researching this stuff, you are going to find a plethora of information written by Planned Parenthood designed to whitewash the whole racist history of Planned Parenthood as an organization. If you do that, I would encourage you to allow it to be a red flag to see how dogmatically Planned Parenthood has gone back to revise the books, to revise the writings, to revise the speeches that were given by Margaret Sanger in a way to make it look like birth control never meant abortion. And I thank you, John, for explaining that the way you did just now, that really they talked about birth control not at that time in terms of contraception. When they used the word birth control, they were really talking about abortion. And now Planned Parenthood can say, well, she never wrote about abortion. She wrote so much about birth control.
Yeah, and I would add,
it's really
Mark,
a deceitful turn of events.
Yeah, I would add that many of our African American friends are very well aware of the forced sterilization that was really promoted heavily throughout the South. I know that in 1973 there was a big expose by Essence magazine exposing about how many doctors were enlisted to do forced sterilization, not even telling women what they were doing to them, and they were doing it in the name of we need less black babies being born. So it's out there. It's a painful, horrible history. And
well, you and I discussed an article. If anyone is wanting to dig in a little bit to some of this whitewashed history, there was an article that was written in 2014 in the Washington Times. I think we're gonna paste the link to that article into this webinar so that you can read it. It was written by Ariana Grossu, and it's called Margaret Sanger, Racist Eugenicist Extraordinaire. And it really is a biting expose of Margaret Sanger's historic ties with the Ku Klux Klan and eugenics and racism. That's something that you can go back and read if you are duped into the modern whitewashed version of history that Planned Parenthood did not, in fact, start with these terrible condemning and damning roots.
Yeah.
Just moving on from there, we're talking about the ties to racism and abortion and how they cannot be unraveled, and that in fact, to end racism, we really must come to an end of abortion in America. Another point is that just philosophically and morally, the evil of racism and the injustice of abortion really are at the baseline, are the same sin, just outworked in different ways. They are two fruits of the exact same evil, and that evil is that we are devaluing the image of God that is placed on all human beings equally, regardless of color, race, creed, socioeconomic level, what nation you live in, what language you speak. To devalue the image of God by aborting any human being is a grave injustice that really just devalues the majesty and the glory of God himself. Every human life carries the majesty and glory of God himself. And it seems to me, as we're talking about the history of Planned Parenthood and the civil rights movement, as that was emerging in the 60s, the civil rights movement really could have given birth at that time to the modern pro-life movement. Don't you agree, John?
yeah, I agree, and I think they almost did, really, because again, Martin Luther King was very diligent about arguing on behalf of the African American and the end of segregation, for example, based on the fact that they are humans, not because they're blacks, because they're humans. But this is the group of people that's being oppressed as humans, and therefore we need to defend them and defend their rights. And of course, the next group, as the civil rights legislation began to pass and be adopted and agreed to across the country in the late 60s, it was right at that moment that we also began to strip human rights from another group of people, and that was the unborn. And interestingly enough, there were a few people who were leaders in the civil rights movement who began to see the connection. One of them, interestingly, was Jesse Jackson. And this is the Jesse Jackson that I love, and where he saw things clearly. And I think there were some other things that were going on that got him off course. But listen to what he said. This is in 1977. As, again, abortion began to spread across the country. He wrote in the Right to Life News in January of 1977, he wrote, How we respect life is the overriding issue. The question of life is the question of the 20th century. Race and poverty are dimensions of the life question, but discussions about abortion have brought the issue into focus in a much sharper way. How will we respect and understand the nature of life itself is the overriding moral issue, not of the black race, but of the human race. And he went on to argue that the language that is now being applied, abortion rather than murder, where they were basically removing the humanity of the unborn in order to justify their actions, he saw that as the very same strategy that they had been fighting against throughout the civil rights movement, in which degrading names are applied to strip people of a sense of their equal humanity. So eventually it didn't work out that way, but ethically and morally, the civil rights movement could have given birth to the pro-life movement.
Wow, it's amazing to think of it that way. And Alveda King now is using the terminology of one race, not the black race, not the white race, but one race, the human race, which is really where the civil rights movement has led at this point with folks like Alveda King. And we agree with that. That sentiment, I think, should be expressed with a louder microphone. Moving on, just economically, the two concepts of racism and abortion are linked because the abortion industry really profits mostly on the backs of the minority communities in the United States. The African American population right now stands somewhere between 12 and 14%, but African American abortion rates account for about 36% of all the abortion that happens in the United States right now. And then you've got the Latino population, somewhere between 13 and 14, 15% of the American population, and yet 20% of all American abortions happen within the Latino community. So you've got 25, 27% of the population of the United States accounting for somewhere between 50 and 60% of the abortions that happen in the United States right now.
Yes, I'll even go further, and I'll say this, that when African Americans and Latinos not only join the pro-life effort, but help lead the effort, it will utterly collapse the abortion industry. Because like you say, the economics of abortion are racist in its foundation. It feeds itself primarily and disproportionately off our minority neighborhoods, which is why I went down to Miami some years ago to help with the churches there. They had 37 abortion clinics in Miami back in 2006 when I got there. And we mapped them all out, and they were all, well, not all, but they were almost all were in the minority neighborhoods, and the exceptions were, there were a few down by the University of Miami also targeting college students. But abortion traffics in the shedding of innocent blood, feeding off of the fears primarily of our minority communities. So when the pro-life movement arises and expands to include more and more of our minority community, then the business of abortion will collapse. That's just the reality. Alveda King is the niece of Martin Luther King. And I've known her for a number of years, and I've grown to respect her much. And she said something to me once that I never forgot. She says that she believes that the pro-life movement is the natural extension of the civil rights movement. And she says that her uncle, Martin Luther King, often asked the question, how can the dream survive if we murder the children? So it's interesting how she sees these two linked together today as well. And I believe, again, that we as people concerned about human life in the abortion issue need to recognize that when it comes to defending the weakest among us, it comes to whatever color they have or whatever the size they happen to be.
Well, and so we come, John, to the point in our discussion where we have to look at what is going to be our response to the situation today. How are we going to respond to the inflammatory things that are happening in our nation, and recognizing, as we've discussed today, the inextricable tie between racism and abortion? How do we respond as Christians? And as you mentioned early on in our recording today, one great response, one necessary response, is just to grieve, just to absolutely let God break our hearts. About 2 months ago, I began to read the book of Lamentations, and I just got stuck. I got stuck on chapter 3 in particular. I didn't move out of it for about 6 weeks. I read chapter 3 several times every day. And it just strikes me that, we need to know how to lament and grieve the terrible circumstances that are happening in the world, because the world that we live in is not heaven. It is broken. It has sin in it. And yet God is good. God is going to redeem us, and He is waiting to receive us. So there are these promises within Lamentation that, boy, the world is difficult, but God is powerful and has the ultimate victory. So we just need to learn to sit in our grief and let God renew us from a place of brokenness. Number 2, we need to pray that we can all see more clearly, more visibly, the links between racism and abortion, the ones that we've discussed today. We should do our research. We should look back at the history of Planned Parenthood and the history and the speeches that were given by Margaret Sanger. And you can Google the racist comments that Margaret Sanger made over the years and begin to get a pretty holistic idea of why she did what she did. So we need to see that more and more clearly, and we need to pray that God would help us to be instruments of exposing or bringing light to the darkness and the shroud of mystery behind the abortion movement and why it's tied to racism. And then number 3, we need to do something with our hands. We need to do something concrete and positive and active and proactive. And one easy and obvious way of getting involved in that is to link up with whatever local pregnancy help ministry exists in your area. We call them pregnancy help centers or pregnancy resource centers. We at Passion Life go around the world and teach good biblical theology, pro-life biblical theology, and let people start what we call pregnancy help ministries, because that looks different in every place that we go to. The locals determine the best way to help women in crisis pregnancies in their communities. Most of the places, both in America and overseas, that we're working with are working with minority women. The pregnancy help movement largely is reaching out to minority women in our communities and in communities around the world. Passion Life is working in places like Cuba, India, Vietnam, countries in the world that are suffering the highest rates of abortion. And we go to those places. It's often the minority women in those places that are being targeted by the abortion mills and the abortion clinics for the highest numbers and the highest concentrations of abortion. So, friends, brothers, sisters, if this is something that inflames you or impassions you or motivates you, we invite you, we warmly beckon you to join us at PassionLife Ministries. We go around the world teaching that racism cannot exist in the heart of the true Christian who believes that the image of God is in every human being. And we are here to fight racism and fight abortion, both in the United States and around the world. Isn't that right, John?
Yes, because abortion is an attack against the integrity of God in the same way that racism is. And if you want to do something about systemic racism, then we need to fight against this deep-rooted industry of abortion and this mindset, because the two are linked together. So come on in and join us. We really appreciate you following some of the work that we're doing, and stand for life with us at Passion Life. We'll be glad to welcome you and get you involved with the local pregnancy center, and you're doing something that I think promotes racial justice in the best sense of the word and promotes the gospel of life.
Amen.
Amen. Well, let's
Thanks for
meet up
joining
again.
us.
Yeah. All right. God bless you all.